The Magical Peacock and the Despicable Neighbour. Once upon a time, there was a little town, and in that town lived the Maple family. The Maple family were the happiest family of all. The family had 4 members, Mother Christine, Father Thomas, and 2 children, Anna 12 and Tim 9. They loved and respected each other. But this wasn't the only reason they were so happy and popular in their town. The reason was because they had the most beautiful peacock in the world. The peacock was so colourful that even the best painter in the world couldn't paint such a beautiful bird. When the family went shopping in the town, they always took the peacock with them. People would smile and clap every time they saw the Maple family and their bird.
So beautiful, peacock so colorful, feathers shine like rainbows in the sky. How are you so beautiful? How are you so colorful? A bird so wonderful that stands before our eyes. You walk like a star in the street. Take pictures with everyone you meet. We're all clapping loudly, clap along. Shine like the moon in the night. Each feather is glistening bright. We come just to bask in your glorious light. You are the star of the show. Painters have tried to capture your beauty. Poets attempt to write of your glory. Storytellers tell your story, but your brilliance can't be summed up in words. Peacock so beautiful, peacock so colorful, feathers shine like rainbows in the sky. How are you so beautiful? How are you so colorful? A bird so wonderful that stands before our eyes.
But not everyone liked the family and their gorgeous bird. Mrs. Wilson, their neighbour, was a very scary person. Nobody knew Mrs. Wilson well. She wasn't nice and always looked angry and had no friends at all. Mrs. Wilson was also very jealous of the Maple family and their bird. One day she said to herself, "I will find a more beautiful peacock than the one the Maple family has." So Mrs. Wilson decided to go to the other town to see if she could buy the most beautiful peacock in the world. But she couldn't find one. Then she travelled to the big city. But even in the big city, she was unable to find what she was looking for. She travelled across the world, but she wasn't able to find such a beautiful, colourful bird. She was very upset and angry when she had an idea. If I can't find one, I will create one. On her way home, she bought an average-looking peacock and some paint. As soon as she got home, she used the paint to colour the peacock in a way more beautiful than the world had ever seen. She used yellow, green, blue, then red, pink, and finally purple. Mrs. Wilson laughed out loud. "My peacock is now more beautiful than the Maple's bird." The very same day, Mrs. Wilson decided to go shopping in the centre of the town with her peacock. People were amazed. They smiled and clapped and said, "Wow, Mrs. Wilson, your bird looks absolutely beautiful." The Maple family heard the news about this bird and decided to see the peacock for themselves. When they got to the post office, they saw Mrs. Wilson smiling in front of a large crowd and showing her bird proudly. When the Maple family got nearer, she started to laugh and said, "Ha, ha, My bird is the most beautiful bird in the whole world. But no sooner had she said these words when it started raining. It only took a few seconds for the rain to wash all the paint from the bird's feathers. People stopped smiling and started to look disappointed and angry. "Cheat! You are a cheat, Mrs. Wilson," said the crowd, and they all walked away, except Mrs. Wilson, who stood there in the rain looking at her peacock. She was upset for the bird, for the rain, and everyone who laughed at her. The next day, the Maple family decided to pay a visit to the old tailor who lived near the post office in a little house with a red door. They wanted him to make new coats for Anna and Tim, as Christmas was just a few days away. But there was a problem. They couldn't find their peacock. Tim and Anna ran outside and looked everywhere, but the peacock was nowhere to be seen. The whole family rushed into the street and started searching for the peacock. They knocked on other people's houses, but the peacock could not be found. Many people joined the search to find the peacock. They went to the town and then to the forest, but the peacock was still missing. Just before sunset, Mr. and Mrs. Maple thanked their neighbours for their effort and help and returned home. Tim and Anna were very sad. Before bedtime, both parents gave them a big hug and said, "Don't worry, children. Don't be sad. We love you very much. We will find our peacock one day." Later, when the parents went to sleep, Anna and Tim were still up, talking quietly next to a small candle near the window. "I think Mrs. Wilson stole our bird," said Tim. "I think you're right. We need to get him back," said Anna. So Anna and Tim agreed that the next day they would go to Mrs. Wilson's house and get their peacock back. The morning was really cold, so Tim and Anna wore their warmest coats, hats and scarves and started their secret journey to Mrs. Wilson's house. When they reached the house, they made sure that Mrs. Wilson wasn't home. Anna and Tim saw that one of the windows was open, so Tim decided to jump in while his sister was outside watching for Mrs. Wilson. When Tim got into the house, he repeated softly, "Peacock, Peacock, where are you?" First, he checked the ground floor and then upstairs, but he couldn't find that beautiful bird. When he looked at the kitchen floor, he saw a large feather and a huge pot. Tim was sure that he'd found evidence that Mrs. Wilson took their bird and maybe ate it. Tim shouted to Anna, "Get help! Get help! I think Mrs. Wilson cooked our beautiful bird." Anna panicked and ran home to Mr. and Mrs. Maple for help. "Mother! Father! Help! Tim is in Mrs. Wilson's house and found a feather from our bird and a large pot. Mrs. Wilson cooked our bird." Mr. and Mrs. Maple quickly called others to make sure there were more witnesses around when they finally caught Mrs. Wilson. In the meantime, Tim was walking around Mrs. Wilson's house and saw pictures hanging on the wall. In one picture, Mrs. Wilson was smiling happily with her family. "I've never seen Mrs. Wilson smiling or happy," said Tim quietly. "Why is Mrs. Wilson so angry all the time?" Tim asked himself. Then he realized Mrs. Wilson had returned, was walking up the stairs and putting her key in the keyhole. Tim remembered the open window and just managed to jump outside before Mrs. Wilson opened the door. Tim wiped his forehead and said, "Oh dear, that was close." Then he heard a crowd of people walking towards Mrs. Wilson's house. The angry crowd was led by Mr. and Mrs. Maple. When they got to the house, they started calling Mrs. Wilson's name. "Mrs. Wilson, come out right now!" shouted the crowd. When Mrs. Wilson opened the door, she looked frightened. Mrs. Wilson asked, "What's happening?" Mr. and Mrs. Maple said, "We believe you have taken our bird, and we demand that you return him to us." Mrs. Wilson looked scared, as the crowd were clearly angry, and she said, "I have no idea where your bird is. I did not take him. I would like to have a look inside your house, especially the large pot in your kitchen, said Mr. Maple. Mrs. Wilson had no choice than to let the crowd into her house to look around. When Mr. and Mrs. Maple lifted the lid of the large pot, everybody was sure that finally they'd caught Mrs. Wilson and the cooked peacock would be in the big pot. But the pot was empty. The crowd felt a little disappointed, but also relieved at the same time. Looking angrier than ever, Mrs. Wilson asked the crowd, "Are you satisfied?" "Yes, and we are terribly sorry for the inconvenience we have caused you," said Mrs. Maple as the crowd left the house. Mrs. Wilson slowly walked to her living room, sat down on her sofa, and started crying. Tim was still under her back window when he heard Mrs. Wilson crying, and although he was a little bit afraid of her, he stood up slowly and asked, "Why are you crying, Mrs. Wilson?" At first, Mrs. Wilson tried to hide her tears, but just couldn't, and she said, "I am crying because no one likes me." Tim felt so sorry for Mrs. Wilson. He said quietly, "I do like you a little bit." Mrs. Wilson started smiling and asked Tim if he would like to have a hot chocolate on the front porch of her house. "Yes, I'd love to, Mrs. Wilson," Tim shouted. He then sat down on a wooden bench in front of the house and waited patiently for his favorite drink. When Mrs. Wilson gave the hot chocolate to Tim, he immediately had a sip and said, "Wow, Mrs. Wilson, this is the best hot chocolate I have ever had." Tim and Mrs. Wilson had a great conversation, and Tim asked Mrs. Wilson why she seemed to be so angry all the time. "Am I looking angry now?" asked Mrs. Wilson. "Not now, but most of the time," answered Tim. "I am not angry, but disappointed, dear Tim. My husband passed away a long time ago, and I have 2 children, Alex and Claire, living in the big city. They do call me sometimes, but they are very busy with their lives. I can't even remember the last time I gave them a hug or kissed their cheeks." "That is not right, Mrs. Wilson. Alex and Claire should visit you sometimes," said Tim. "You know, dear boy, living in the big city is different. It's a busy life there. Everyone is running around, and time goes much faster in the big city than here in the countryside. I am not blaming them. They are working a lot. They both work for the old clock bank near the train station." Mrs. Wilson was just about to cry when Tim stood up and, giving her back the empty mug, said, "Thank you for the hot chocolate. It was amazing." "You are very welcome, Tim," Mrs. Wilson replied. As Tim walked down the stairs, he looked back to see her eyes fill with tears.
Some people who keep just to themselves look like they don't need anyone else. Those people that we judge are the people who need love more than you could guess. Have you ever been the smartest or the strongest? Have you ever been the one who wins it all? Still, you know you feel so low each time you fall. If you don't reach for help, how will anybody else know? Some people who seem better off alone. You think you see an empty heart, but it's just an empty home. Those people that we judge are the people that need love more than we could know. Oh, why are we afraid to love the lonely people? Just because they're different Don't you know your friends were all once strangers? It's time to open up, take the first step. And as you spread your love, the world will open up. We rise, we fall, and through it all, we'll have each other's back. Have you ever been the smartest or the strongest? Have you ever been the one to win it all? Still, you know you feel so low each time you fall. If you don't reach for help, how will anyone else know? Why are you afraid to love the lonely people? Just because they're different from the rest. Don't you know your friends were all once strangers? It's time to open up, take the first step.
When Tim got home, his sister Anna shouted, "Where have you been, Tim? I was so scared." "I was talking to Mrs. Wilson," explained Tim. Then he and Anna sat down in the kitchen and he told her about Mrs. Wilson's children, husband, and the big city. "Oh no," said Anna. "Poor Mrs. Wilson. So she wasn't angry, but lonely. We need to help her," said Anna. "How?" asked Tim. "We are going to the big city tomorrow with Mum and Dad, and we will find Mrs. Wilson's children and talk with them." "Yes!" shouted Tim loudly. The next day, they all travelled to the big city by train, and while Mr. and Mrs. Maple were busy shopping, Tim and Anna asked for permission to go around the big city for just a few hours. "Are you sure you two can look after each other?" asked their mother. "Yes, we are," they replied. They all agreed on a time and a place to meet in a few hours and got some taxi money too. Tim told Anna where Mrs. Wilson's children worked, so they decided not to waste time and head straight to the old clock bank near the train station. When they got there, they were amazed. The bank was huge and there was a giant clock on the top of the building. Many people walked in and out at the same time. It was the busiest and the largest bank in the world. Tim and Anna walked in the bank, and a man walked towards them and asked, "How can I help you?" "We are looking for Alex and Claire Wilson," said Anna. "Of course. Please come with me," the man replied. They entered a lift and went up to the top floor. The lift door opened, and they found themselves in a room full of papers. There was a mountain of paper in the room, and there they were, Alex and Claire, looking like they were trying to sort through a gigantic amount of paper. "They do look very busy," said Tim to Anna. "Yes, they do," Anna agreed. "Excuse me," said Anna quietly. But there was no reply. They just kept working. "Excuse me," said Anna again, but there was still no reply. Alex and Claire worked so hard they didn't even hear Anna. Then, suddenly Tim shouted, "Alex! Claire!" Finally, they stopped working and asked, "Who are you?" "I am Tim, and this is my sister Anna. We are here because we need to tell you that your poor mother is missing you very much and would like to see you." "Mother! Oh dear, we have forgotten her," Alex and Claire admitted. Tim walked up to them, looked in their eyes and said, "Your mother is very sad. She needs you. Anyway, it's not right that you don't visit her." Alex and Claire nodded their heads. "You are so little and so brave to come to us. Thank you, Tim and Anna. It is very kind of you to remind us, and we promise we will visit our mother very soon." "Good, because you don't want me to come back again," Tim said. They all started to laugh and then said goodbye to each other. Tim and Anna quickly went back to their parents and stayed with them all day. When they returned home, their Peacock was sleeping in the garden. "Yes, you are back! You are back!" Anna shouted happily. The whole family was very happy that finally their beautiful bird had returned home. A few days later, Christmas Eve arrived. The Maples had a huge Christmas tree and lots of Christmas decorations inside and outside the house. It looked so beautiful, like thousands of stars in the clear sky. They were just about to have a nice meal, but before dinner, they started listening to some music and singing. When Tim looked outside, he realized that Mrs. Wilson's house was dark. There were no Christmas lights or any lights at all. "Are Alex and Claire not with her?" Tim asked his sister. "I don't know, Tim. Let's go over." Tim and Anna asked their parents if they could bring a guest home. "Somebody nice?" asked Mr. Maple. "Not necessarily," said Anna and Tim. Mr. and Mrs. Maple looked at each other and agreed. Why not? This is Christmas after all. Tim and Anna quickly dressed in coats and hats and walked over to Mrs. Wilson's house. They knocked on the door, and Mrs. Wilson slowly opened it. "Hello, Tim and Anna. What are you doing here?" she asked. "Are you alone?" asked Tim. "Yes, as usual, watching TV," said Mrs. Wilson sadly. "We would like to invite you to come over to our house to have dinner with us, Mrs. Wilson," said Tim. "I don't even know what to say," replied Mrs. Wilson. "Say yes, Mrs. Wilson. Please, you need to show my mum how you do the hot chocolate," said Tim with a big smile. "All right. Let me grab my coat and we'll walk over in a minute." As soon as they got home, Mr. and Mrs. Maple looked surprised to see Tim and Anna had brought Mrs. Wilson with them. But after a few seconds, they welcomed Mrs. Wilson and asked her to take a seat at the dinner table as the evening meal was just about ready. Then, suddenly somebody knocked on the door. Mr. Maple opened the door, and there were Alex and Claire standing outside with 2 large pieces of luggage. "Good evening. Sorry for knocking at your door, but we are looking for our mother, Mrs. Wilson." "Oh, yes, she is here. Please come on in," said Mr. Maple. As soon as Alex and Claire walked in, Mrs. Wilson cried out, "Alex, Claire, my children are here. My children finally came home." Alex and Claire gave their mother hugs and kisses. Tim and Anna looked at each other proudly. "We did it, Anna. We did it," said Tim happily. "My children," said Mrs. Wilson. "You should have sent me a letter or called to let me know you were coming. I don't have much food at home, and I didn't cook a Christmas dinner." "No problem. We have plenty, so please stay with us," said Mrs. Maple. "Thank you very much. This is very kind of you," said Mrs. Wilson. This was a great lesson for Tim and Anna. It taught them that people are not always what they appear. And from that day forward, Mrs. Wilson was never lonely again, and she was loved by the Maple family and all those who tasted her hot chocolate. The end.